This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Here is another Beyond the Big Screen teaser for episodes coming soon. I hope you enjoy and definitely tune in for the full episodes. If you want to learn more, you can head over to beyondthebigscreen.com. You can support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon and Subscribestar. By joining on Patreon and or Subscribestar, you can help keep Beyond the Big Screen going and get many great benefits. Benefits include advertisement-free content, bonus content, and early access. The bonus content is great too. I will feature outtakes from episodes and live streaming episodes. If you join at the executive producer level, you will become just that, an executive producer of Beyond the Big Screen. You will be able to develop ideas for upcoming episodes, help find great guests, and of course have your name mentioned at the beginning or end of each episode. You won't just be a supporter, you will be a critical member of the team. Go over to patreon.com/Beyond the Big Screen or subscribestar.com/Beyond the Big Screen to learn more. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com, or follow us on social media by searching for A2Z History. I will see you next time Beyond the Big Screen. There's a lot of raw recruits as well who are, if we're talking November of 42, these people have not been in the Army very long. What kind of quality and in terms of training were these troops, and even motivation, you might say?
Well, they had good training, and I would say pretty good motivation. Remember, this is still early in the war. When the Army showed up, Pearl Harbor had been just about a year ago. And so there was still a lot of anger and desire to get revenge for Pearl Harbor. I think a couple of characters mentioned that, if I remember correctly. And so they were well trained. They maybe weren't quite as elite as the Marines, but I don't want to give the impression that they were just a bunch of, total nincompoops or whatever. They really weren't, because they were green. Probably most of the guys, this was their first battle. Some of these guys had never even left the U.S. Some of them hadn't even left their own hometowns. And so they're seeing this place, which is at one time, or in one sense, it's a beautiful tropical paradise. And then in another sense, it's a living hell. That's one of the themes too. We'll get into that later about how man turns paradise into hell. But anyway, so yeah, there were a lot of old Army guys. Most of the ones who were officers and sergeants would have been in the Army since before the war. Most of the buck privates and maybe the lower people like the corporals, people who are just above private, they might have been pretty new as well. The character Whit, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about Whit, but Whit is a private, but I believe, if I remember correctly, in the book, he was a sergeant who had been busted back down to private. They say explicitly in the movie that he had been in the Army for 6 years. So we're talking 1936, this guy had been in there. And then Sergeant Welsh, Sean Penn's character, the implication is that he'd been in even longer, perhaps.
Is it something that you saw? Affairs, because nominally coming out of World War I, the United States and Japan are allies to some degree.
That's right. It kind of, I think it really starts with the Washington Naval Conference. And I think Japan's looking at that because it really looks like it's the Americans that are trying to stunt the Japanese. And the Japanese are already, by that point, they've got a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. I think you can look back at the Russo-Japanese War, where at least the people felt like the Treaty of Portsmouth they got the short end of the stick, and they're looking at the way the Americans and the British act, and they're saying, what's the difference? So the Americans are complaining that we got into a war with the Russians. Okay, but if you look at 4, 5, 6 years before that, the Americans were in a war with Spain, and the Americans take the Philippines, and it's their colony. And Americans don't realize, and I don't think I actually brought this part up in the shows, but there's a pretty dirty war that goes on in the immediate aftermath of the United States taking the Philippines, where we're fighting against the Filipinos. We're fighting an insurgency against us, our empire. And it's pretty brutal. And so the Japanese are looking at that and they're like, oh, okay, so that's how empires act. They look at what the British had done. I mean, just about everywhere, right? You could look at India or, in Africa, certainly. They're looking at the Americans. Everybody can look at the Americans and kind of how we subjugated people. Specifically, I'm thinking of like the Native Americans. And so they're looking at all this and they're learning, and they're like, okay, so that's how you act.